Hi folks, in this video, I'm going to show you how to perform a Pearson product moment correlation coefficient using Excel. Recall from the JASP video where we showed you how to perform this exact same procedure that we used a data set that was known as the Big Five personality traits. And this is a psychological concept that was developed in 1949 that was really trying to understand human behavior. And as you can see from the slide, there are 5 characteristic traits that go into the Big Five personality traits. And they are agreeableness, openness, neuroticism, conscientiousness, and extroversion. And so the researchers were really interested, and they took a group of people that had 500 participants, and they explored and gave folks a questionnaire on specific character traits relevant to neuroticism, extroversion, openness, agreeableness, and conscientiousness. Now, they took this group of people, they had them complete this questionnaire, and they had data in each of these 5 buckets or domains that were thought to be related to the Big Five personality traits. But the real question with this data set is, are any of these particular character traits related to one another? And so, because we're interested in whether this relates to that, a Pearson product moment correlation coefficient is the right tool to answer the question. To answer the question, we're going to need 3 formulas, and they are going to include the variance equation, the covariance or shared variance equation, and then, of course, converting the covariance equation to the Pearson product moment correlation coefficient. So once we understand the context of this study, the next thing we need to do is jump over to Excel. So once we jump over to Excel, remember, we're starting with a blank database here. So to go ahead and get started, I'm just going to quickly refer to my JASP file here, and I'm going to just go and copy and paste some of that data over. But in the assignment, you would be using the actual data that is either provided to you or that I ask you to generate. And so if you look in JASP, you can see that we have 5 columns, and each of these columns represent variables, which represent each of the 5 personality traits in the Big Five personality traits domain. When we look at the rows, you can see that we have 500 individual participants who completed this questionnaire and who were able to generate a neuroticism, extroversion, openness, agreeableness, and conscientious score. So to go ahead and perform this data analysis, we're going to go ahead and we're going to take this data. And so in the real world, you would collect the actual data, but for purposes of this exercise, I just want to show you how to calculate this. So if I move over and grab my data here, you can see that I can copy and paste each of these variables. And I'm not going to do it for all 5 of these variables, but the process would be exactly the same for each of the 5 domains of the Big Five personality trait. But if I was to copy and paste that data into my Excel calculator here, and I was to create something known as a participant ID, I would be able to very easily move this data by double-clicking this box and choosing to fill the series, and I would have a unique study ID number for each of the 500 participants in my study. And you can see that each participant has a neuroticism, an extroversion, an openness, an agreeableness, and a conscientious score. Okay, so let's go ahead and start calculating some of these values. So the first thing that we need to think about is look at variance, right? So I'm going to take my 3 equations here, and I'm going to move them into Excel because that makes things a lot easier to work with, right? And so if I open up my Excel calculator here, let's focus on whether there's a relationship between neuroticism and extroversion for purposes of this tutorial. But in the real world, we would go through the actual process of calculating all possible relationships for all 5 variables. So we would theoretically be able to determine the relationship between neuroticism and extroversion, neuroticism and openness, neuroticism and agreeableness, neuroticism and conscientiousness, and all possible combinations of those Big Five. But I'm going to just focus on the first 2 just for this exercise. I'm going to delete those columns for now. Okay, the first thing that I need to do is I need to be able to determine the variance of each of my variables themselves. And so neuroticism is going to serve as my X, and extroversion is going to serve as my Y. And so if we come to the bottom over here, Remember, the first thing in order to get variance is I need to set my cell equal to average, and I need to know the mean of the neuroticism scores. So I'm going to set the cell equal to B2, and then I'm going to have a colon down to B501, and that is because the first row of data represents the variable names. I'm going to go ahead and close my parentheses and hit enter, and you can see that I'm giving a mean neuroticism score for the sample of 500 people. Okay, now, if I come back up to the top here, the next thing that I need to do is I need to be able to calculate the deviance score, right? And so in order to calculate the deviance score, I'm going to take this particular person's value, and I'm going to minus it from the mean value, which we determined was that 2.82 number. So that's B503, column B, row 503 in this case. So I'm going to go $B, which holds the column, $503 is going to hold the row, and that's going to represent the mean. So if I go ahead and enter there, you can see that I'm given a deviance score for that particular value. But to save time, right, I'm going to go to the bottom right-hand corner. I have my black crosshairs, and I can double-click that, and it's going to run the deviance scores for all of the 500 people in my data set. So once I have that there, the next thing I need to do, of course, is deviance squared, since if we sum the deviances, we're going to get 0. So I'm going to take this deviance value and multiply it by itself, and I'm going to run that down for each of the 500 people. And at the bottom here, I can then generate the sum of squares total by setting the cell equal to equals sum, open parentheses, D2, since that's the column I'm working with, to D501, and close that parentheses, and now this effectively represents my sum of squares total. This represents my mean, and once I have sum of squares total, I can then determine the variance, which if we come back up, you can see here that the variance is the sum of squares total divided by n minus 1. And so because I have 500 people in my data set, I'm going to take that, and to determine the variance, I'm going to take the sum of squares total and divide it by 500 participants minus 1 restriction is 499, and I get the variance of 0.20488,146. Okay, so now that we've gone ahead and we did that for our variance equation of the first variable, I'm going to go ahead and you would perform the exact same procedure for extroversion. So let's go ahead and do that now. Okay, so now that we have the variance for both our X predictor in neuroticism and our Y criterion in extroversion, the next thing that we need to think about is what's known as the covariance, or the shared variance between X and Y. And so in order to determine that, we're going to need the sum of X1 minus the mean, that's deviance for X, and we're going to multiply that by X1 minus the Y mean, or the deviance for Y. And so because we have the deviance score for both X and Y, we're just going to take the cross products and multiply the deviances by themselves and sum that column. So to do that, we're going to create a column that's known as cross products, and we're going to take the deviance for X, in this case it's C2, and multiply it by F2, which is the deviance for Y. And so if we figure out the cross products, or how much X and Y overlap for that person, we can then go ahead and run the column down for that and take the sum of that, which gives us our numerator. So I'm just going to move these two pieces over here, and we want the sum of H2 through H501, close parentheses, and you can see that you get this negative 28.07146. So that's our sum of the cross products, okay, which effectively answers the question of the numerator, right? Sum of, that's what the sigma sign equals, and you have the cross products, right? So you take each individual person's value minus the mean, deviance for X, and you multiply it by each individual person's deviance value for Y, and then we sum all of it, which is what we just did. Then we're going to take the sum of the cross products and divide that by n minus 1, and that's going to give us covariance. And so if you took the sum of the cross products, divided by 500 people minus 1 restriction is 499, you would get a cross product value of negative 0.05. Okay, so this represents our covariance. And so if we come back up, the last formula then we need is we need to be able to determine the covariance of x and y, which is what we just calculated. That's our numerator. And we're going to divide it by the standard deviation of x times the standard deviation for y. So that's simple enough. If we first come down to the bottom here, we already had the variance for all of these things. So then the only thing that we needed to think about is how do we calculate standard deviation for those values. So if we wanted standard deviation for our x and we wanted our standard deviation for our y, we can go ahead and calculate those values, right? Because we know that all we have to do to get from variance to standard deviation is to take the square root of the variance. So if I take the square root of the variance for x in this case, close parentheses, I get 0.45. And if I take the square root of the variance for y of 0.126, I can see that I get the standard deviation for the y, an extroversion. And so the combined standard deviation, or the cross product standard deviation, if you will, for my Pearson product moment correlation coefficient would be equal to the standard deviation for x times the standard deviation for y, and that is going to represent my denominator in this case. And so the Pearson's R would be the covariance divided by the standard deviation for x times standard deviation for y cross product, and you can see that we would get a Pearson's R of negative 0.350. Now, if we wanted to quickly just jump back over to JASP and confirm that the relationship between neuroticism and extroversion was in fact negative 0.350, we can go ahead and do that. So let's go ahead and jump over to JASP. Let's quickly run our regression and correlation here. And we were interested in neuroticism and extroversion, and we wanted our Pearson correlation. And you can see that the neuroticism value of negative 0.350 matches the Excel file that we just calculated for negative 0.350. So I hope this video was helpful. In the next video, we'll go ahead and show you how to calculate linear regression. We'll see you there.